The house felt bigger than ever, its silence stretching into every corner. It wasn't always like this. There used to be a rhythm to the days, a steady hum of conversation, the faint echo of laughter, the clinking of glasses over shared meals. But those sounds had faded long ago, leaving only the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. It had been 3 years since my husband passed, 3 long years of figuring out how to live without him, how to breathe in a space where every corner carried his memory. I thought I was getting better at it, learning how to fill the emptiness with routines and small distractions. But there were moments, like now, standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at a sink full of dishes, when the loneliness hit with a force that left me breathless. Nathan's arrival had been unexpected. He showed up at the door one rainy afternoon, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and an apologetic smile on his face. "I'm sorry to drop in like this," he'd said, his voice warm and familiar. "I just needed a place to figure things out." I didn't ask for details. The look in his eyes, a mix of exhaustion and quiet vulnerability, told me enough. He had always been a kind soul, the sort of young man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaint. Seeing him like that, so raw and unguarded, had stirred something in me. "Of course," I'd said, stepping aside to let him in. "Stay as long as you need." That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, as I stood in the kitchen, reaching for a jar of spices on the top shelf of the pantry, I found myself thinking about him more than I should have. The house wasn't quite so empty with Nathan here. His presence filled the spaces I hadn't realized were so hollow. The sound of his footsteps as he moved about the guest room, the quiet hum of his voice when he was on the phone, even the way he left his coffee mug on the counter. It all brought life back to a place that had been stagnant for so long. But it also brought complications. Nathan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered. He'd grown into a man, broad-shouldered, confident, with an easy smile that had a way of disarming even the most guarded people. And while I tried to remind myself of the years that separated us, of the roles we were supposed to play, there were moments when I caught myself lingering too long on the way his laugh lit up a room, or how his eyes softened when he spoke to me. I knew better. I had to know better. I was reaching for the jar when I felt him behind me. His presence was unmistakable, solid and warm, the faint scent of cedar and something clean wafting over me. I froze, my hand hovering just shy of the jar, my breath catching in my throat. "Let me help," Nathan said softly, his voice close enough to send a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, his hand brushed lightly against my waist as he reached past me, his fingers closing around the jar with ease. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it left a trail of heat that lingered long after he stepped back. "Got it," he said, his tone casual as he set the jar on the counter. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thanks," I managed, my voice shaky. Nathan's eyes met mine, his expression open but unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Fine," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Just tired." He nodded, though the look he gave me suggested he didn't quite believe me. "You should take a break," he said, his voice softer now. "You've been running yourself ragged." "I'm fine," I repeated, more firmly this time. Nathan hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he stepped back. "If you say so," he said lightly, though there was a note of concern in his voice. As he left the kitchen, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. It was just a moment, a small kindness, nothing more. But as I stood there, staring at the jar on the counter, I couldn't shake the memory of his hand brushing against my waist, the way my skin had seemed to come alive beneath his touch. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if I was wrong. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, the unease from earlier still clung to me. The brief moment in the pantry had replayed in my mind all afternoon, each detail sharper than it had any right to be. The heat of Nathan's presence, the way his hand had brushed against me, and, most unsettling of all, the way it had lingered in my thoughts long after he was gone. I told myself I was being ridiculous, reading too much into something that meant nothing. But when I heard his voice call out from the living room, warm and easy, I felt that same flutter in my chest, unbidden and undeniable. "Hey," Nathan said, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his hair slightly mussed, as though he'd been lying down. "What do you think about letting me cook tonight?" "You?" I asked, arching a brow. He grinned, the boyish charm in his expression making it hard not to smile back. "Don't look so skeptical. I'm not half bad, you know." I hesitated, the tension of the day still weighing on me. But the hopeful look in his eyes, so earnest, so unguarded, made it impossible to say no. "All right," I said, crossing my arms. "Show me what you've got." Nathan moved around the kitchen with an ease that surprised me, pulling ingredients from the fridge and cabinets, as though he'd been living here for years. "I didn't realize you knew your way around a kitchen," I said, leaning against the counter as I watched him. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he replied, glancing at me over his shoulder. There was a teasing note in his voice, but something about the way his eyes lingered on mine made my stomach tighten. "Like what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Nathan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Like the fact that I make a mean chicken Alfredo," he said, holding up a jar of cream with a flourish. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the heaviness that had been sitting in my chest all day. "I'll believe it when I taste it." The kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aroma of garlic and cream as Nathan worked, the clatter of pans and utensils creating a rhythm that felt strangely soothing. I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders easing as I leaned against the counter, sipping a glass of wine. "Can you grab me the Parmesan?" Nathan asked, nodding toward the fridge. "Sure," I said, setting my glass down. When I handed him the cheese, our fingers brushed, and for a moment, I froze. It was such a small thing, so fleeting, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. Nathan's gaze flicked to mine, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice quieter now. "Of course," I replied, my own voice trembling slightly. The moment passed quickly, but it left a mark. A quiet hum of something unspoken lingering in the air between us. By the time we sat down to eat, the sky outside had darkened, the faint chirp of crickets filling the stillness. Nathan had set the table, without me noticing, placing a candle in the center, as though this were something more than just a casual dinner. "This smells amazing," I said, eyeing the plate of creamy pasta in front of me. "Taste first, then compliment," Nathan teased, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I took a bite, the flavors rich and decadent, and let out a soft hum of approval. "All right, you win. This is incredible." "See, told you I wasn't half bad," he said, his grin widening. We ate in companionable silence for a while, the soft flicker of the candlelight casting shadows across the room. But as the meal wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was watching me, his gaze steady and intent. "What is it?" I asked finally, setting my fork down. Nathan hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I'm just glad you let me stay," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's been a while since I felt like I had a place to land." His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You'll always have a place here," I said softly. Nathan's eyes softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. "I mean it," I added, my voice trembling slightly. "I know," he said, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and I found myself struggling to breathe under the intensity of his stare. But before I could say anything more, Nathan leaned back in his chair, the moment breaking as he reached for his wine glass. "Thanks for trusting me with dinner," he said lightly, his tone teasing. "Anytime," I replied, forcing a small smile. But as we cleared the table and said goodnight, I couldn't ignore the quiet hum of something new that had settled between us, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The morning sunlight poured over the yard, golden and warm, promising a beautiful day. I stood on the porch, a cup of coffee cradled in my hands, staring out at the garden that had long since been overtaken by weeds. It was one of those projects I'd told myself I would get to someday, but the thought of tackling it alone always felt too overwhelming. "Looks like it needs some work," Nathan said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see him stepping out onto the porch, barefoot and holding his own mug of coffee. His hair was still tousled from sleep, and his t-shirt clung slightly to his chest from the humid air. "More than some," I replied, smiling faintly. "It's been years." "Well," he said, leaning against the railing, "today seems like a good day to do something about it." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to help me with the yard?" "Why not?" he asked, his grin easy and boyish. "It'll give us something to do. And I could use the fresh air." I hesitated, glancing back at the overgrown mess. "It's not going to be easy." "I'm tougher than I look," he teased, his eyes glinting. It wasn't the challenge I was worried about, but I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded and set my coffee cup down. "All right. Let's see what you've got." We started with the weeds, pulling out the invasive tangles that had crept into every corner of the garden. The work was tedious and dirty, but Nathan tackled it with enthusiasm, his laughter filling the air whenever he unearthed a particularly stubborn root. "You weren't kidding about this being a mess," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Don't say I didn't warn you," I replied, grinning. The sun climbed higher, and by mid-morning, we were both covered in dirt and sweat. But as the yard slowly began to take shape, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Nathan crouched beside me, pulling out the last of the weeds from a flower bed. "So what's next?" he asked, glancing up at me. "We plant," I said simply, nodding toward the small stack of flowers and shrubs I'd bought months ago but never found the energy to use. Nathan's grin widened. "Now we're getting to the fun part." As we dug holes and set the new plants in place, the air between us felt light, the conversation easy and unguarded. Nathan told me stories about his life in the city. The people he'd met, the job he'd left behind, and the reasons he'd felt so lost before coming here. "It sounds like you've been through a lot," I said softly, pressing a mound of soil around the base of a daisy. He shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. "I guess, but coming here has helped." "You've helped?" I glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "I haven't done anything." "You've done more than you realize," he said, his gaze steady. The intensity of his words left me breathless, and I quickly turned back to my work, unsure how to respond. By the time we finished, the yard looked completely transformed. The overgrown mess had been replaced with neat rows of flowers, the bright pops of color standing out against the rich, dark soil. "It looks amazing," Nathan said, stepping back to admire our work. "It does," I agreed, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. Nathan turned to me, a faint smile playing on his lips. "See? We make a pretty good team." I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Don't get too comfortable. There's still the back garden to deal with." "I'm ready when you are," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes warm. We sat on the porch afterward, sipping lemonade and letting the cool breeze wash over us. My muscles ached from the work, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that came from doing something worthwhile. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "I needed this," he said, his voice quiet. "What, hard labor?" I asked, smiling. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, this, being here, spending time with you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly, my fingers tightening around my glass. Nathan's gaze lingered on me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Me too," he said finally. The quiet stretched between us, filled with the hum of cicadas and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the kind of silence you shared with someone who understood you, even without words. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the day we'd spent together. The easy laughter. The way his hand had lingered just a little too long when he'd passed me a trowel. The warmth in his voice when he said he was glad to be here. I told myself it was nothing. Just a natural closeness that came from working together. But deep down, I knew better. Something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend I didn't feel it. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and freshly planted flowers as I stepped onto the porch that evening. The yard looked beautiful in the fading light, but it was the kind of beauty that made your heart ache, that reminded you of everything you'd been missing for so long. I sat down on the swing, pulling a blanket over my lap and nursing the glass of wine I'd poured after dinner. The night was quiet, save for the faint chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I let the stillness settle over me, hoping it would quiet the thoughts that had been racing through my mind all day. But when I heard the creak of the screen door behind me, my chest tightened, the familiar flutter of anticipation stirring within me. Nathan stepped onto the porch, a beer in his hand and his hair slightly damp from a shower. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the porch and sitting beside me on the swing. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, his voice soft. "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "I don't mind." He smiled faintly, leaning back and stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while we sat in silence, the swing swaying gently beneath us, the soft creak of the chains blending with the sounds of the night. "You've been quiet tonight," Nathan said eventually, breaking the silence. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "Just thinking," I said. "About?" I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "Everything." "Nothing. I don't know." Nathan turned to me, his gaze steady. "You can talk to me, about anything." His words, so simple yet so earnest, sent a pang through my chest. I looked down at my wine, swirling the liquid in the glass. "It's not that easy," I said softly. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because some things are better left unsaid," I replied, my voice trembling. Nathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared out at the yard. "I don't believe that," he said finally. I glanced at him, startled by the conviction in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I think the things we're most afraid to say are the ones we need to say the most," he said, his gaze still fixed on the garden. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my throat tighten. "What if saying them changes everything?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe it's supposed to." The quiet between us grew heavier, thicker, until it felt almost unbearable. I set my glass down on the small table beside me, my hands trembling slightly. "I've been scared," I admitted finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Ever since your father died, I've been so scared of everything. Of being alone, of moving on, of feeling something again." Nathan's expression softened and he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "Not with me." His touch, his words, they unraveled something deep inside me, something I had spent years trying to keep locked away. "I don't know how to do this," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to let myself feel like this." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Nathan said gently, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "We'll figure it out together." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the quiet strength in his gaze, the unwavering steadiness that had always made me feel safe. Before I could think better of it, I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder. Nathan didn't hesitate, his arms sliding around me, pulling me closer. We sat like that for a long time, the swing swaying gently beneath us, the night wrapping around us like a cocoon. "Thank you," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. "For what?" Nathan asked, his voice low. "For being here," I said, my throat tightening. "For not giving up on me." Nathan pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, his lips lingering for a moment. "I'll never give up on you," he said quietly. His words broke something in me, and I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. I clung to him, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt as the sobs racked my chest. Nathan held me through it all, his arms steady, his voice soothing as he murmured soft reassurances. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back slightly, my gaze meeting his. The moonlight illuminated his face, casting soft shadows across his features, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Nathan," I began, but the words faltered on my lips. "It's okay," he said softly, his hand lifting to brush a tear from my cheek. "You don't have to say anything." But I wanted to. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the feelings I had been so afraid to admit to myself. Instead, I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his. The closeness was intoxicating, the warmth of him seeping into me, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone. The storm rolled in just after midnight, the sound of rain tapping against the windows pulling me from a restless sleep. I lay there for a moment, listening to the low rumble of thunder in the distance, the flicker of lightning casting brief shadows across the room. Something about the storm felt ominous, charged, as though it carried the weight of everything I had been trying to ignore. I got out of bed, pulling on my robe, and made my way downstairs. The house felt too quiet, too still. The storm outside only amplifying the tension simmering inside me. I had just reached the kitchen when the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, the familiar hum of the refrigerator replaced by an eerie silence. I fumbled for the drawer where I kept the flashlight, my hands trembling as I searched blindly. "Nora?" The sound of Nathan's voice made me jump, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the storm. "It's just the power," I said quickly, my voice shaky. "I figured," he replied, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Nathan closed the distance between us, his presence steady and grounding. "You sure?" he asked, his tone softer now. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to convince him, or myself of. He found the flashlight before I did, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Here," he said, handing it to me. His fingers brushed against mine, and even in the dim light, I could see the concern in his eyes. "Thanks," I murmured, taking the flashlight and flicking it toward the pantry. Nathan didn't move, his gaze lingering on me. "You seem on edge," he said after a moment. "It's just the storm," I replied, turning away to busy myself with finding candles. "It's more than that," he said gently. I froze, my back to him, my chest tightening at the quiet certainty in his voice. "Nathan, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please what?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. I turned to face him, the flashlight casting a faint glow between us. "Please don't make this harder than it already is," I said, my voice trembling. Nathan stepped closer, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "What if it's supposed to be hard?" he asked quietly. "What if that's the point?" The air between us felt impossibly thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Nathan took another step closer, his gaze steady, his voice low. "Talk to me, Nora," he said softly. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking this is wrong," I said, my throat tightening. "Then why does it feel so right?" he countered, his voice quiet but firm. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "Because it's not supposed to be like this. You're... Don't," he interrupted, his voice gentle but commanding. "Don't put up walls we both know aren't real." The truth of his words cut through me, and I felt the first tear spill over, hot and unrelenting. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice breaking. Nathan closed the remaining distance between us, his hand lifting to cup my cheek. "So am I," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean we should ignore this." His touch was steady, grounding, and I found myself leaning into him despite every voice in my head screaming at me to stop. When he kissed me, it wasn't sudden or rushed. It was slow, deliberate, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The warmth of his lips against mine unraveled every thread of restraint I had been clinging to. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him, as though he were the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Nathan's arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and the world outside seemed to disappear. The storm, the darkness, the weight of everything that had been holding me back. There was only him, only us, and the quiet, desperate need to feel something real. When we finally broke apart, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, I felt tears slipping down my cheeks. "Nora," Nathan said softly, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said, his gaze steady. "Together." His words, his touch, the quiet conviction in his voice, it was enough to make me believe him. For the first time, I let myself lean into him completely, letting the storm rage outside while I found a fragile, fleeting sense of peace in his arms. The dawn broke quietly, the storm leaving behind a muted stillness that settled over the house. I stirred in bed, the faint warmth of sunlight brushing across my face, but it wasn't the light that woke me. It was the weight in my chest, a mix of emotions too tangled to name. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around me as I glanced toward the window. The world outside looked fresh and new, the rain having washed away the dust of the past few days. But the air inside the room felt heavy, thick with the unspoken truths and impossible questions that had filled the night. I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, and my heart quickened despite myself. Nora? Nathan's voice was soft, tentative, as though he wasn't sure if he should be here. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair slightly tousled, his expression cautious but warm. He held 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling lazily into the air. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet. "Morning," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. Nathan crossed the room, setting one of the mugs on the nightstand beside me. He didn't move too close, as though he was giving me space to decide what came next. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but charged, every unsaid word hanging in the air like a question. "I didn't mean to wake you," Nathan said finally, his tone careful. "It's okay," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Nathan hesitated, his gaze flicking to mine. "How are you feeling?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was anything but. I took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste steadying me as I searched for an answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I feel everything, all at once." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Me too." The honesty in his voice, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes, it broke something in me, and I felt the tears welling up again. "I don't know what happens now," I said, my voice trembling. "We don't have to figure it all out today," Nathan said gently. He stepped closer then, crouching slightly so he was at eye level. "We'll take it one step at a time, together." His words, so simple yet so sure, settled over me like a balm. I nodded slowly, unable to trust my voice, and Nathan reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the mug. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of it, it was enough to quiet the storm inside me, if only for a moment. Later that morning, we found ourselves in the garden again. The air was crisp, the ground still damp from the storm, and the flowers we'd planted days before seemed brighter, more vibrant. Nathan knelt by one of the flower beds, pulling a few stray weeds, while I stood a few feet away, watching him. "You don't have to do that," I said, crossing my arms. "I don't mind," he replied, glancing up at me with a small smile. I couldn't help but smile back, the weight in my chest easing just a little. "You're going to spoil me," I teased, though my voice was soft. "Maybe you deserve to be spoiled," he said lightly, though there was an undercurrent of sincerity in his tone that made my breath catch. I crouched beside him, my fingers brushing against the damp soil as I worked beside him. For a while, we didn't speak, the quiet between us filled with the sounds of the garden, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of birds, the steady rhythm of our movements. But the quiet wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't charged or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, easy, the kind of silence that felt like a shared understanding. When we finished, we sat together on the porch, our hands dirty, our faces smudged with soil. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed as he tilted his face toward the sun. "You look happy," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Nathan opened his eyes, turning to look at me. "I am," he said simply. The honesty in his voice, the ease in his expression, it was enough to make my chest ache. "I don't know how you do it," I said softly, my gaze dropping to my hands. "Do what?" "Be so sure," I replied, my voice trembling. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. "Because I know what I want," he said quietly, "and I know it's worth fighting for." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my throat tighten. "Nathan, you don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Not yet, just promise me you'll give this a chance, that you'll give us a chance." I looked at him, my chest tight with fear and hope and everything in between. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't impossible. "I promise," I said softly, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes. Nathan smiled then, the kind of smile that made the world feel lighter, and I felt something shift deep inside me, a quiet, fragile hope taking root. The path ahead wasn't clear. It wasn't simple or easy, and I knew there would be challenges we couldn't yet imagine. But as we sat there side by side, the sun warming our faces and the garden blooming around us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt alive, and for now, that was enough. It was the kind of moment that should never happen. 1 second, I was stepping out of the bathtub, reaching for the towel I'd left on the counter. The next, my foot slipped on the edge of the damp tile and I fell forward, my towel slipping away as I hit the cold floor. Before I could even gather my senses, I heard the door creak open. "Evelyn, are you?" Aaron's voice cut off mid-sentence as he stood frozen in the doorway. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, heavy with a mix of shock and something unspoken. His eyes met mine, wide with concern at first, but then they flicked downward, just for a second. I scrambled to grab the towel, my hands trembling as I pulled it around me. My face burned, humiliation coursing through me as I stammered. I'm fine, you shouldn't be in here." "I heard a noise," he said quickly, his voice tight, his gaze darting anywhere but at me now. "I thought something happened." "It's nothing," I insisted, though my voice betrayed me. My heart was pounding, and it wasn't just from the fall. Aaron lingered for a moment too long, his hand gripping the doorframe. "Are you sure? You look. Just go," I snapped, desperate to end the unbearable tension. He nodded, backing out of the room and closing the door behind him. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall was deafening, and I sat there on the bathroom floor, clutching the towel to my chest as if it could somehow shield me from what had just happened. It wasn't just embarrassment that left me shaken. It was the way he had looked at me. That brief flicker in his eyes before he'd turned away. It was an accident. I knew that. But in that fleeting moment, something had shifted, and no amount of rationalizing could undo it. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I found him in the kitchen, pretending to be busy with a plate of leftovers. He didn't look up when I walked in, and I hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry," he said abruptly, his voice breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I interrupted, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Let's just forget it happened, okay?" He nodded quickly, his shoulders tense as he stared down at his plate. "Yeah, of course. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. It was an accident," I told myself repeatedly. Just an awkward, uncomfortable moment that we'd both move past. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the subtle changes in the air between us. The lingering glances, the charged silences, the way my heart raced every time we crossed paths. What had started as an innocent mistake was quickly becoming something I couldn't control. Before Aaron moved back into the house, my days followed a simple, predictable rhythm. Mornings were spent tending the garden, afternoons lost to household chores or reading in the sunlit corner of the living room, and evenings stretched into quiet solitude while my husband, Frank, busied himself with his endless hobbies or stayed out late with his golf buddies. Frank and I had been married for 13 years, a second marriage for both of us. By the time we met, neither of us were looking for romance, just companionship. And that's what we'd become to each other, companions who shared a house but not much else. Frank's idea of quality time was discussing his latest stock tips over coffee, and I had long since stopped hoping for anything deeper. Then Aaron came home. Frank's son had always been polite but distant with me. Our relationship had never been close, mostly because I saw him only during the occasional holiday or family event. He had spent most of his 20s in the city, chasing a career in architecture and a series of girlfriends who never seemed to last. When his latest breakup sent him reeling, Frank insisted he come home for a while to reset. "We've got the space," Frank had said casually over dinner. "And I'm sure you won't mind having someone around during the day while I'm out." I smiled tightly and nodded. What else could I say? Frank rarely consulted me on decisions like this. The day Aaron arrived, I was standing at the sink, rinsing out coffee mugs, when I heard his voice in the foyer. "Hey, Dad," he called out, his deep, easy tone filling the house. I wiped my hands on a towel and turned just as he appeared in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said with a nod, his lips curling into a polite smile. "Aaron," I replied, returning the gesture. He had changed since I last saw him. Gone was the lanky college kid with shaggy hair and baggy clothes. The man standing in front of me was broad-shouldered, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his posture confident. He had an air of casual charm about him, the kind that made people gravitate toward him without effort. "I appreciate you letting me crash here for a while," he said, his tone sincere. "Of course," I replied, though I wasn't sure what else to say. Frank appeared then, clapping Aaron on the back. "Let's get you settled," he said, guiding him toward the stairs. I watched them go, a strange tension settling in my chest that I couldn't quite place. It didn't take long for Aaron to settle into the rhythms of the house. He spent his mornings at the dining room table with his laptop, job hunting, or working on design projects. In the afternoons, he often helped me in the garden or fixed things around the house that Frank had been ignoring for years. "You've got quite the green thumb," he remarked one day as I showed him how to prune the rose bushes. "It's just a hobby," I said, though I couldn't help but smile at the compliment. "Well, it shows," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned back to the roses. It was little moments like that, small, harmless exchanges, that began to shift the dynamic between us. Frank, of course, was oblivious. He spent most of his days on the golf course or in his study, tinkering with his antique watch collection. The few times he was home for dinner, he and Aaron would talk stocks and sports, while I quietly sipped my wine and pretended not to notice the way Aaron's eyes would flick to mine when he thought no one else was looking. It wasn't just me who noticed the change. Even our housekeeper, Mabel, commented on it one afternoon while she was dusting the shelves in the living room. "Aaron's a handsome young man," she said casually, her tone teasing. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You should tell him that. I'm sure he'd appreciate the ego boost." Mabel smirked. "Oh, he doesn't need me to tell him. He already knows." Her words stuck with me, though I wasn't sure why. And then there was the incident with the tub. For days after, I tried to convince myself that it hadn't meant anything, that it was just an awkward moment we'd both moved past. But something had shifted between us, and no amount of denial could change that. It was in the way Aaron lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, his questions about my day more thoughtful than they needed to be. It was in the way he looked at me when Frank wasn't paying attention, his gaze steady and searching. And it was in the way I felt when he was near, an awareness I hadn't felt in years. A pull I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the guest room, Aaron appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "Need a hand?" he asked. I shook my head, my heart skipping a beat at his sudden presence. "I've got it." He stepped inside anyway, picking up a towel from the pile and folding it with surprising precision. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he placed the towel on the bed and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "About the other day." I froze, my hands stilling over the pile of laundry. "Let's not talk about it," I said quickly. "Why not?" he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "Because it doesn't mean anything," I replied, though the words felt hollow. Aaron stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "Are you sure about that?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The air between us felt heavy, charged, and I knew that whatever line we'd been towing was about to be crossed. The first kiss was a mistake, or at least, that's what I told myself afterward. It happened late one evening after Frank had gone to bed. I was in the living room, curled up with a book I wasn't really reading, when Aaron walked in. He was barefoot, his shirt untucked, and he had that disheveled, end-of-the-day look that only made him seem more relaxed, more confident. "Still up?" he asked, his voice low, casual. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, setting the book aside. "What about you?" He shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Just thinking." "About?" He hesitated for a moment, then stepped further into the room. "About what I'm doing here. What I'm doing with my life." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "It's kind of pathetic, isn't it? Coming back here at my age." "It's not pathetic," I said quickly. "Everyone needs a reset sometimes." He gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You really believe that?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And you shouldn't be so hard on yourself. You're allowed to figure things out." Aaron looked at me then, really looked at me, and the air in the room shifted. "You're easy to talk to," he said softly. I smiled, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened. "That's what stepmothers are for, right?" "That's not what I meant," he said, taking another step closer. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he was there, standing in front of me, his gaze locked on mine. "Evelyn," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have stopped him. I should have said something, anything, to break the spell, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen as he leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, but full of everything we hadn't been saying. When he pulled back, I stared at him, my heart racing. Aaron, we can't. I know, he said quickly, his voice raw. I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about you. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I stood, stepping back, putting distance between us. This can't happen, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. Aaron nodded, his jaw tightening. I'm sorry. I needed you to know how I feel. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and left the room, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. But it didn't end there. The tension between us only grew in the days that followed. We avoided being alone together, but every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark waiting to ignite. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, washing dishes. He glanced at me as I walked in, his expression guarded. About the other night, he said, breaking the silence. Let's not talk about it, I said quickly. Why not? He asked, his tone quiet but insistent. Because it was a mistake, I said, though even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. Aaron set down the dish he was holding and turned to face me. It didn't feel like a mistake to me. I froze, my heart pounding. Aaron. I mean it, Evelyn, he said, his voice steady. I've never felt like this about anyone before, and I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it. I looked away, my chest tightening. This isn't fair to Frank, to either of us. Do you love him? Aaron asked suddenly, his question cutting through the air like a knife. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Aaron nodded, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. That's what I thought. The second kiss wasn't a mistake. It happened a week later, late at night, when Frank was out at one of his poker games. I was in the garden, trimming the rose bushes by the light of the patio lamp, when Aaron appeared. You're always out here, he said, his voice breaking the silence. It's peaceful, I replied, not turning around. He stepped closer, his presence sending a jolt through me. You're avoiding me. I'm not, I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. You are, he insisted, his tone soft but firm. And I get it, I do. But I need to know. Do you feel it too? Or am I imagining this? I turned to face him, my breath catching at the look in his eyes, so open, so vulnerable. Aaron, this is complicated, I said quietly. That's not an answer, he replied, stepping closer. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before finally whispering, yes, I feel it too. He didn't wait for me to say anything else. He closed the distance between us, his hands cupping my face as he kissed me. This time, there was no hesitation, no restraint, and this time, I didn't stop him. What started as a single moment spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, stealing moments when Frank wasn't around, keeping our relationship hidden behind closed doors. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide. One afternoon, while Frank was at the driving range, Aaron and I sat in the library, our heads close together as we pretended to discuss a book. His hand brushed mine, and I pulled away quickly, my eyes darting to the doorway. This is too risky, I whispered. Aaron leaned closer, his voice low. You're worth the risk. His words sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. The danger, the guilt, the consequences. But danger was always lurking. It was during one of these moments that Mabel, our housekeeper, walked in unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen with Aaron, his hand resting lightly on my waist as I leaned against the counter. Mabel froze in the doorway, her eyes flicking between us. Am I interrupting something? I stepped away from Aaron quickly, my face burning. No, of course not, I said, my voice higher than usual. Mabel didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. As she left the room, Aaron turned to me, his expression serious. She knows, he said quietly. She doesn't know anything, I replied, though my voice wavered. We need to be more careful, he said, his jaw tightening. I nodded, but the knot of fear in my chest refused to ease. Secrets like ours are never safe for long. The house that had once felt so quiet, so predictable, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock on the door, was a reminder of how fragile the illusion of normalcy really was. It wasn't just Mabel's knowing glances or Aaron's inability to hide his growing frustration. The real threat came in the form of Frank's sister, Claire, and Aaron's best friend, Jeremy. two people who had a knack for prying where they didn't belong. Claire was the first to sense that something was off. She arrived unannounced one Sunday morning, her arms laden with groceries and her sharp eyes scanning the house as though she were an investigator looking for clues. "Thought I'd come by and check on my brother's little kingdom," she said, her tone dripping with passive aggressiveness. "Claire," I said, forcing a smile as I took a bag from her arms. "This is a surprise." "Good thing, too," she replied, stepping past me into the kitchen. "Surprises keep everyone honest." Frank chuckled, completely missing the edge in her tone as he followed her inside. But I didn't. Over the next hour, Claire made herself at home, asking questions that seemed innocent but were anything but. "So, how's Aaron adjusting?" she asked, her gaze flicking to me as she sipped her coffee. "Fine," I replied quickly. "He's been a big help around the house." "I'll bet," she said, her smile sharp. "It's nice to see him spending time here." He's always had a way of charming his way into people's lives. The implication in her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Maybe you can give him a nudge about getting back out there," Claire continued, turning to Frank. "It's not healthy for him to stay cooped up here too long. Don't you think, Evelyn?" Her eyes bore into mine, and I realized she wasn't just fishing. She was hunting. Then there was Jeremy. He showed up later that same week, his usual laid-back demeanor masking a sharpness that put me on edge. He and Aaron spent most of the afternoon in the backyard, drinking beers and catching up. But when I stepped outside to bring them some snacks, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Hey, Evelyn," Jeremy said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We were just talking about you." "Nothing bad, I hope," I replied, forcing a laugh. "Not at all," he said, though his gaze lingered on Aaron for a moment too long. "Just wondering how you're keeping this guy in line." Aaron shifted uncomfortably, and I quickly changed the subject, but the tension in the air was palpable. Later, when I passed the living room, I overheard snippets of their conversation. "She's great, isn't she?" Jeremy was saying. "Jeremy, don't," Aaron replied, his tone sharp. "I'm just saying," Jeremy continued. "You're acting different, man, and I think I know why." The close calls didn't end there. One afternoon, while Frank was out, Aaron and I were in the library. He was sitting beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm against mine. "You're tense," he said quietly, his voice full of concern. "I'm fine," I replied, though my hands were trembling as I tried to focus on the book in my lap. "No, you're not," he insisted, his hand brushing mine. I looked up at him, my chest tightening. "Aaron, we can't keep doing this." His expression hardened. "Don't say that. Not after everything." Before I could respond, the sound of a door closing echoed through the house. "Evelyn?" Claire's voice called out, followed by the unmistakable click of her heels on the hardwood floor. Aaron and I jumped apart, panic flashing in his eyes as I stood quickly, smoothing my dress. "In here," I called out, my voice shaky. Claire appeared in the doorway a moment later, her gaze flicking between us. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, though the smug look on her face told me she wasn't sorry at all. "Just dropping off some papers for Frank." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. She lingered for a moment too long before finally turning and leaving. As soon as she was gone, I sank onto the couch, my heart racing. "She's watching us," Aaron said quietly. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The pressure was unbearable. Between Claire's suspicion, Jeremy's probing, and Mabel's knowing looks, I felt like the walls were closing in. Then, one evening, Frank blindsided me. We were sitting at the dinner table, his voice casual as he asked, "Have you noticed anything strange about Aaron lately?" I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" "He's been different," Frank said, his gaze steady. "More defensive? And he spends a lot of time with you, doesn't he?" I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "We're just getting to know each other better? Isn't that a good thing?" Frank didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The final straw came when Jeremy confronted Aaron directly. It happened late one evening, after Frank had gone to bed. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up, when I heard raised voices coming from the backyard. "You're playing a dangerous game," Jeremy was saying. "Stay out of it," Aaron snapped. "I'm your friend, man," Jeremy shot back. "I'm trying to help you before you screw up your life. Or hers." I couldn't hear Aaron's response, but the tension in his voice sent a chill down my spine. When Aaron came inside, his expression was dark, his jaw tight. "What did he say to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Nothing I didn't already know," he replied, his tone bitter. "Aaron, this is getting out of control," I said, stepping closer. He looked at me, his eyes filled with frustration and something deeper. Something I didn't want to name. "Then let's leave. Let's just go." His words hit me like a thunderclap, and for a moment I considered it. Leaving everything behind, starting over somewhere far away. But the weight of what that would mean pressed down on me, and I shook my head. "I can't," I whispered. Aaron's expression hardened, and he turned away. "Then we're running out of options." The storm came crashing down faster than I could prepare for it. For weeks I'd felt it brewing, the way Claire lingered when she visited, the way Jeremy's probing questions cut too close, and the way Frank's patience was slowly unraveling. Aaron and I thought we had control, that we could outmaneuver their suspicions. We were wrong. It started with Frank's sudden change in behavior. He began coming home earlier, skipping his usual rounds at the golf course or poker nights. He hovered more, asking pointed questions about how I spent my days and why Aaron hadn't pulled his weight by finding a job yet. One evening, as I cleared the dinner table, Frank leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Evelyn," he said, his voice too casual, "do you think Aaron's staying here too long?" I froze for a moment before forcing myself to keep moving. "He's figuring things out, Frank. You wanted him here, remember?" "I did," Frank replied, his gaze sharp. "But I didn't expect him to get so comfortable." The words hung in the air, and my hands tightened around the edge of the plate I was holding. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. Frank's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. He didn't have to. A few days later, Claire arrived unannounced, as she often did. This time she had an agenda. She cornered me in the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning my face as I wiped down the counters. "You've seemed distracted lately," she said, her tone light but probing. "Just busy," I replied, avoiding her gaze. "Busy with what?" Claire asked, her smile sharp. "Because from what I can tell, Aaron's been the one keeping you occupied." I froze, the implication in her words hitting me like a slap. "Claire, that's a ridiculous thing to say." "Is it?" she countered, stepping closer. "I'm just calling it like I see it, and I've seen the way you two look at each other. You're not as subtle as you think." The blood drained from my face, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You don't know what you're talking about." Claire's smile widened. "Maybe. Or maybe Frank needs to hear what I think." That night, I found Aaron in his room, pacing. "She knows," I said quietly, closing the door behind me. Aaron stopped, his expression darkening. "Claire? She's threatening to tell Frank," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do." Aaron stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders. "We need to get ahead of this. Tell him ourselves." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "We can't. Frank will. He'll." "Evelyn," Aaron interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't going to end on its own. We have to take control before it all blows up." But before we could decide what to do, the decision was made for us. The following evening, Frank called me into the study. Aaron wasn't home. He'd gone out to meet Jeremy, though I had my doubts about whether he'd actually show up. Frank was sitting at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look up as I entered, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. "Sit down," he said, his tone flat. I hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "I've been thinking," Frank began, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "About you. About Aaron. About this house." My stomach twisted, but I said nothing. "Claire's been saying some things," Frank continued, his voice calm but deadly. "Things I didn't want to believe at first. But now, I'm not so sure." "Claire's always been dramatic," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Frank's gaze snapped to mine, his eyes hard. "Is she wrong?" My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low, "if there's something you need to tell me, now is the time." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the front door slammed. "Aaron." The next few moments unfolded in slow motion. Frank stood, his expression darkening as Aaron's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Aaron appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw us. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze flicking between me and Frank. Frank stepped toward him, his fists clenched at his sides. You tell me, Aaron, what's going on? Aaron's jaw tightened and he glanced at me before turning back to Frank. Nothing. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Frank barked, his voice echoing through the room. Aaron stood his ground, his shoulders squared. I'm not lying. Frank turned to me, his eyes blazing. Evelyn, is he lying? The room fell silent, the weight of the question pressing down on me like a physical force. I felt Aaron's gaze on me, steady and unyielding, and I knew that no matter what I said, nothing would ever be the same. My voice broke and I looked away, tears streaming down my face. Frank's face twisted with rage, and he turned back to Aaron. Get out, he said coldly. What? Aaron said, his voice rising. You heard me, Frank growled. Pack your things and get out of my house. Frank, wait. I started, but he cut me off. And you, he said, his voice shaking with fury. Don't think this is over. Later that night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I heard the sound of Aaron's suitcase wheels on the tile floor. I stood as he approached, his face shadowed, but his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. I'll call you, he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out the door. The house was unnervingly quiet after Aaron left. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves knew what had happened. I stayed in the living room long after he was gone, staring at the door he had walked out of, waiting for something. Frank had retreated to his study, and I could hear the faint clink of his whiskey glass against the desk. When I finally forced myself to move, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, dreading the conversation that was waiting for me. Frank was sitting in the armchair by the window, the glass of whiskey in his hand now empty. He didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel the weight of his anger radiating across the room. Frank, I started, my voice trembling. Don't, he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. He set the glass down with more force than necessary and finally turned to face me. How long? He asked, his voice low but venomous. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. It wasn't. How long? He repeated, each word laced with fury. I closed my eyes, tears spilling over as I whispered, a few months. Frank let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. A few months, he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. While I've been here in this house trusting you? Trusting him? It wasn't like that, I said quickly, though I knew how hollow the word sounded. It wasn't planned, Frank. It just... Don't you dare tell me it just happened, he growled, standing abruptly. You're my wife, Evelyn, and he's my son. I know, I said, my voice breaking. I know how wrong it is, but I can't undo it. Frank stared at me, his expression a mix of anger and hurt. For a moment I thought he might yell, throw something, demand more answers, but instead, he just shook his head. I can't even look at you right now, he said quietly. He brushed past me on his way out of the room, leaving me standing there, shaking. The next morning, Frank was gone. His car wasn't in the driveway, and he hadn't left a note. I told myself he just needed space, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with time. I spent the day in a haze, wandering the house aimlessly, trying to avoid the places that reminded me of Aaron. But everywhere I turned, there he was, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the library where we'd stolen so many moments. By evening, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Aaron's number, my hands trembling as I waited for him to pick up. Evelyn, he said softly when he answered. Tears filled my eyes at the sound of his voice. I don't know what to do, I whispered. I'll come back, he said immediately. No, I said quickly, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. You can't, not now. Then meet me, he said. Anywhere, just tell me where. I ended up meeting him at a small motel on the edge of town, a place far enough away that no one would recognize us. When I walked into the room, he stood and crossed to me in 2 long strides, pulling me into his arms. I missed you, he murmured against my hair. I closed my eyes, breathing him in. I don't know how we fix this, Aaron, I said, my voice trembling. We'll figure it out, he said firmly. We just need time. But time was the one thing we didn't have. The next morning I woke to find my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from Frank. Come home. We need to talk. My heart sank, and I knew what was waiting for me. When I walked into the house, Frank was sitting at the dining table, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked up when I entered, his expression cold and resolute. I've been talking to my lawyer, he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Frank, I started, but he held up a hand to silence me. You've made your choice, Evelyn, he said, and now I'm making mine. I want you out of this house by the end of the week. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay composed. Fine, I said quietly. If that's what you want. Frank nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. It's what has to happen. Later, as I packed my things, I felt a strange sense of relief. The life I'd been clinging to for so long was gone. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Aaron called that evening, and when I told him what had happened, his response was immediate. Come to me, he said. We'll figure it out together. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe.